to all of our listeners today. My name is Andrea Seidt. I am Ohio's Securities Commissioner, and I'm so excited to have Kelley Griesmer with us today. She's President and CEO of the Women's Fund. So welcome, Kelley.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and
So,
excited to see you.
Yes. So for those who don't know, Kelley and I have a little bit of history. I'm very honored, I think, to have met you very early on in my professional career. You certainly are an inspiration to many of the working women in the city of Columbus. So why don't you start and just tell us a little bit about your history? You know, who's Kelley Griesmer? I met you in the legal world. But why don't you talk about that transition?
Yeah, well, let me just say, equally my honor to have been able to mentor you so early in your career. I still remember you sitting there at that table right out of Ohio State, so where we both went, right? So
Go Bucks.
Go Bucks. I started at Jones Day because it's interesting. It's kind of where my thoughts about women's equity and equality starts, and I didn't know that at the time because I ended up in law school because I wanted to be a journalist. And becoming a journalist was really difficult, you know, and there wasn't a lot of people encouraging me. I wanted to work for Rolling Stone, and that was in New York.
That makes perfect sense.
And coming out of my journalistic experience at a really good journalism school at Indiana University, no one encouraged me to do anything but go back home and find something safe. Wow. And so I went to law school, which was an incredibly safe and wonderful decision, but it really wasn't where my heart was. And so I had this warrior spirit that I learned to live out and became a law clerk and became a lawyer at Jones Day with you and had a wonderful career there of about 13 years and was able to mentor women like you and was able to work on really difficult cases, and I loved it, but it also wasn't where my heart was. And so when I had been a partner for about 6 years, which was a big deal, right? At the time that I was a partner, there were 600 partners and there was only 100 of us that were women.
Wow.
So that shows that there certainly was not equity in how women were advancing. And that wasn't that law firm's fault. It is something that's illustrative of every single profession, really, is that women have a hard time navigating because of the norms and the biases about who should be promoted and who should advance in their career. And so I took a pretty hard left turn and went to a nonprofit. A really good friend of mine almost died of cancer when he was 40 and became the CEO of Pelotonia at the time.
Something you, if you're in Central Ohio, have certainly heard about.
I hope, and was very lucky that we had funding that allowed a great team of people to come together at that time and start that bike ride. And it really wasn't about the bike, it was about cancer research. But it's what made me so passionate about nonprofit work because I realized that when you fund social change and you allow people, a grassroots movement of people, to take control of funding the things they know they need to do, it happens, and there's literally cancers that are going away because of those people that fundraise every single year. And so I was able to marry sort of the spirit with the passion, but I had been on the board of the Women's Fund. And so after I left Pelotonia, I went to the Columbus Foundation for about 3 years and did a lot of special projects based on really that community energy.
The big table.
The big table, right, exactly, thank you. The big table, Kind Columbus, some of the efforts that were community facing and really focused on us bringing our collective energies together. But because I'd been on the Women's Fund board from the time I was an attorney, I had started to marry that experience I was having of trying to figure out why my hard work wasn't translating in the way that I thought it would in my career, and at the same time navigating having a son who's almost 20 now. But at the time that was hard, and what I realize now is that the systems weren't built for all of us to succeed, and it really requires a lot of sacrifice, and that doesn't need to happen. And so I ended up being offered the role of the CEO of the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, and we do grant-making research and advocacy focused on that kind of equity work.
Sure.
So I can kind of marry that. We do believe our mission is transforming the lives of women and girls through the collective power and passion of all people working together. And so it's really that collection of what I learned about grassroots movements and equity building and social change. So it's kind of a nice full circle to be where I am right now.
Wonderful. I was going to ask you what drew you to the Women's Fund, but I think you already answered that question.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're very passionate and an inspiration to all of us.
No.
I follow what the Women's Fund does on social media, and I've noticed in the last couple of years you focused a lot on the gender wealth gap. You definitely are out there on Equal Pay Day, which is March 15th. Can you tell us a little bit about unfortunate kind of events that we see still in 2022 when it comes to pay equity and other gender wealth gap issues?
Yeah. So we talk about the wealth gap, which is different than the wage gap.
Right.
And a lot of times people miss that, and I'm not trying to be sort of a stickler about that, but it is important to understand, because what women own will not be solved just by what they earn.
Right.
What they earn is definitely a spoke in that wheel, but there's a whole, there is a whole symbiotic relationship of the support systems that women especially need, and what we find is that when gender or the constructs of gender intersect with other barriers and discriminations and biases like race, like religion, economic status, there's a laundry list, sexual identity. When those things, those barriers intersect with gender, it gets harder and harder.
Right.
So what that means is that in 2019, we decided we would do a wealth gap, we would commission a wealth gap research report. So that's one of the things we raise money to do. We do research, number one, because it helps us educate the community. Number two, it helps us make better grants. And number three, it helps us advocate for better policy. And the research in 2019, it's actually almost remarkable how it worked out, because in April of 2019, we had this research showing that the gender and racial wealth gap for women in Central Ohio was 40 cents to the dollar. So a single woman of a composite woman, of course, which we know does not exist.
Right. So that's worse than the national average.
Well, it's not. For wealth, it's about the same, but it's and that's where you have to keep the wage gap and the wealth gap numbers separately. But the bottom line is it's less than 50 cents for any woman if you just take all women and blend them into one. Intersectionally, it's devastating, because at the same time that a woman, single woman, and the reason I say single is that once you're married, it's very hard to understand what a woman's wealth is anymore, because
it all gets lumped in together.
Correct.
Right.
So so we need disaggregated data, but without it, what we know is that a black woman in Central Ohio in 2019 owned, not earned, owned 2 cents for every dollar that a single man owned.
That's devastating. Wow.
And that's the difference between 40 cents is when you blend them all. So there are certainly some of us that our race doesn't impair us.
Sure.
It isn't a barrier in the way that others do. But for Latina, it's 8 cents that they own. Right. And that was in 2019, pre-pandemic.
Right.
So when I say it was kind of remarkable how it worked out, what we were finding was that because of not only lower wages, less reliable jobs, part-time, seasonal jobs, which women take because there isn't adequate or affordable child care. There's not paid leave. There's not health care. There's this web of things, and so they earn less, and they don't have any of these support systems, or the support systems go away at a very important time when they're starting to accumulate more wealth. The support systems tend to fall away. Benefits Clifford Cavern that a lot of people talk about. So, but what we knew is once we got into the pandemic, 1.1 million women left the workforce voluntarily or involuntarily during the pandemic, and so those figures that I just shared are worse.
That's right. It's going to be worse.
Yeah.
Because the women who come back, there's the unemployment penalty, may not come back and re-enter at the level that they exited. So.
Or they can't, and that's where when you saw women were also unequally and disproportionately represented in all the jobs that were either on the front lines or were eliminated. So the restaurant workers, hospitality workers, they lost their jobs. On the reverse side, nurses, these healthcare workers, childcare workers, people who were literally at the worst risk and had nowhere to take care of their own families while they were trying to provide service to our communities. And so the reason that people call it a she session is because of that disproportionate impact on women during that time.
So that's kind of discouraging. Is there any good news coming out of the pandemic? At least I can speak from my experience working for state government. I do think the pandemic finally opened up our employers to be more open-minded and flexible for teleworking and hybrid work arrangements that might work better. Is it too early to have any data on that or anything that you've seen at the Women's Fund that maybe there's something good to come out of the pandemic?
Yeah, no, there is. There's absolutely, that's the great silver lining. I mean, I'm not a great silver lining person, but that's it. I think that when we say we want all people working together, I talk to a lot of men and fathers and brothers and uncles who took on different roles. These gender norms broke down for a minute. And everyone had to take care of the children because it was the support system was gone. And so I do think, to your point, absolutely, minds grew, hearts grew, the resolve to figure all this out grew. On the other hand, we have to be really thoughtful about the fact that it's not going to come, the fact, as things get better, people tend to get comfortable and just say, well, good, we're back. And to your point, there are still a lot of women who would be a very important part of our economy who are on the sidelines right now. And I will say that if gender norms, there was hundreds of years of gender norms. So to think that a 2-year pandemic changed all that, one of my colleagues at the Ms. Foundation, Teresa Younger, always says, if you want to change generations of implicit bias and discrimination, give us at least a generation. And so we had a pretty compact 2 years that feels like a generation, and I hope that as people are coming back to work, they're realizing these people were productive at their homes. They were able to juggle their schedules.
Definitely.
And what we're hoping is that the schools, which are not child care centers, by the way, two totally different things. But at least the schools are open. I certainly hope people will realize the value of child care systems because that lever is perhaps, we believe, the one that could change everything. And certainly a lot of other things, paid leave and understanding flexible work and that sort of thing. So I do think that happened, but I really, the only thing I'm tentative about is whether people will forget as things get a little more comfortable, forget that those women left the workforce and they're not back. They haven't recovered at the rate that men have recovered in this particular pandemic, and that's why it's called a She Session.
So why do you think we still have the wealth gap? You mentioned gender norms. I want to talk a little bit more about that, and what can we do? What is the Women's Fund doing in order to try to combat those gender norms?
So the first thing that we do, let's talk about gender norms are simply what we are trained to believe as very, very small children. And I tell this story very quickly about my son who went to daycare, in fact, right here in the Rife Center. And he had wonderful teachers there, and he had, it was a great experience, but he was there during President's Day, and they were talking about presidents at 2 years old or whatever, and reading their books and having their little election, and he got in the back seat of my car on the way home, and he said, "Mommy, you can't be president." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "'Cause you're a girl."
Oh, no.
But that's where I look back now, and it hit me that for anyone who doesn't understand gender norms and implicit bias and how it just gets absorbed, it becomes like when you stop at that red light after you've been driving for years. You don't notice anymore you're stopping at a red light. You don't think about stopping at red lights. Well, at 2 years old, my son had already decided, based upon, and not one teacher told him, I was a partner at an international law firm. I was a member of the women's...
You don't know who your mother is, Kira.
Well, and I scared him because, and this is actually the other part of the story, is I scared him. I had a knee-jerk reaction, and I turned to him and I said, "Why did you say that?" And he goes, "I don't know." And that's how adults feel.
That's right.
Today, is that we don't know why we have racial discrimination baked into our systems, why we have gender discrimination based into our systems, and it's because of TV shows and books and things that we read when we were very small. And so gender norms are really these decisions we've made about if a woman has children, she can't any longer. We have a knee-jerk decision that she's not going to make it to work, she's not going to be as dedicated,
Right.
she flexible work means she's not working, and it's a situation in which none of it's substantiated, and we certainly hope that the pandemic has shown differently. But if you think about it. It happens in academia, the way that tenure is awarded. It happens in the way that people advance in promotionally, with promotions in almost any field, as I said.
Right.
So we have to intentionally and vulnerably approach that and say, I didn't create this, but I can change it.
That's right. So what can we do to change it? What is the Women's Fund doing?
Yeah, so the Women's Fund, one of the things, we have a program called Gender by Us, a take on gender bias,
I like
gender
it.
bias.
Yep.
But it was developed, and we go into workplaces and we have vulnerable conversations, meaning that we aren't there to man-hate.
Right.
A lot of people approach me and say, what about my son? What about my husband? I absolutely, this is not about less for them. It is about more for all of us.
They are our biggest supporters in our world, and they're a big part, a part of the partnership that we have to have in order to be successful, right?
Correct. And when we have sons, I mean, we both have sons.
That's right.
I certainly expect him to succeed. I just don't expect him to succeed despite the hard work of those who identify as women around him, who may have the same aspirations, but also the ability to bear children, which whether you have children or not,
Right.
eventually a decision is often made that you aren't going to be as dedicated. And
Right.
so I think we try to go into workplaces and with the Gender Bias program and actually help people vulnerably understand what implicit bias is, understand what discrimination is, understand how it started hundreds of years ago. Go back to Greek literature. Mm-hmm. The gods always had the women fighting with each other.
That's right.
I mean, it was not about the women gods having the men fight with each other. It was the reverse.
That's right.
That's how long ago this started. And I was actually taught that by high school women who invited me to their literature club, and I had never thought about it. So that's a bright spot, that there are young women thinking about these things today. But in any event, what we want to emphasize is the vulnerability of people actually thinking about these definitions, then having some conversation with each other to share their lived experiences and hear what each other say, very similar to the big table.
Right.
And then we ask people to take a little accountability, which is, when you go back into your meetings, how are you thinking about how you write your review of one of your coworkers
Right.
for the year end, whether they should be promoted, whether they should receive a raise. Very importantly, right now, we're seeing a lot of people look at pay history, and when they hire women, they no longer ask them their prior salary to decide their current salary. Why? Because women are traditionally paid less.
Bias, that's right.
And I was just in front of the Franklin County Commissioners, and they were talking very vulnerably about how when they hired people, depending on where they hired a woman from, she might have been making more, and they were just making a decision
Right.
based
We're just giving a bump. We're giving everyone the same bump. Well, it's
percentage-wise.
not fair. That's right.
Percentage-wise, you better all be. That's equity, right? And that, because people don't understand equity, and I always describe it. We love music. I love to go to concerts. I'm 5'2" naturally. Can't grow any higher. If I go to a concert and there's someone who's 6'4" in front of me, I can't see the stage.
That's
If I step in front of the person who's 6'4", even if I didn't get that ticket and that person did, I can see and that person can see.
I love that.
And neither
analogy.
one of us have lost anything.
Yeah.
But someone has recognized that there's an innate something about me that doesn't work. And so we try to help people realize that they're doing that, and that how they can just intentionally find ways to change that behavior and to test it. It's just like you got to think about stopping at the red light every so often.
Right. One more topic before I let you go,
Yep.
and that's female entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
Something else that I've seen the Women's Fund focus on. So you may not always be able to control what your employer does for you, but you can be your own boss.
Mm-hmm.
So what does the Women's Fund do there?
So, when we look at that wealth gap, access to capital is incredibly important to any entrepreneur, as you might guess.
Right.
And of course, as you would also guess, gender norms kick in and show that unless you're a white male, you're very unlikely to get courageous capital, as I call it. And what I worry about is a lot of women do try to be entrepreneurs because, and especially women of color, because they can create their own environment where they can care for those in their families they need to care for, they can do something they care about. But without that capital, what you often see is them working for nothing.
Yeah.
They pay their employees, they take care of their families, and they still don't make any money. So it is about the funding community. And so we, for the most part, can advocate on behalf of for-profit women for this concept of courageous capital. And we do that by advocating, by actually funding nonprofits. Women also start, and especially women of color, start nonprofits at an incredible rate, again, without major funding, often do it as a second job. They're creating some of the most important work in our community. And so what we try to do is courageously fund them. You know, the experience that I had at Pelotonia, the reason people often say, what was the secret sauce? Why were you guys so successful? We had funding.
Yeah.
People wanted us to succeed. It's the same thing in all for-profit work. It's the same thing in all nonprofit work. So we try to courageously raise money, and then we're often the first funder of, especially in at least nonprofits focused on women entrepreneurs. And we look at them and say, do you need staff? Do you need a copier? Do you need a desk? Yes, because that unrestricted operational funding at higher levels will, and breaking that bias that women can't be trusted, they're going to fail, those are all those implicit biases. We have to, in a trust-based, disruptive way, put money in their pockets. And I think that they will indeed prove they were well worth that return on investment.
Splendid. Just one last parting piece of advice for those young women just starting out in their career. Maybe they're starting out on their own, or maybe they're just starting out like us from law school. What do you tell them?
Well, you know, the first thing is that unfortunately what you and I probably realized in our career is that it does exist. The norms exist, and they've been there a long time. And sometimes those of us that have the warrior spirit, we may fare a little better because we refuse to take no. But I read a great book called The Genius of Women, and it's about that concept of there have been a lot of women geniuses throughout history. And they're invisible, but they're invisible. But they're invisible. I mean, they've literally discovered planets and done all these things. And think about the women artists. Think about anytime you go to a museum, how many women artists do you see on the walls? None. Yeah. And do we really think women didn't have any ability to do art? It's impossible. And there were, in fact, there are stories of the multitudes of art that are in basements of museums that doesn't get hung. And I think it's because, again, women are invisible. So what we have to say to young people is, you're not invisible. If you don't have a warrior spirit, that's okay. Find some of us who do.
That's right.
Because we're here to open the, and also know that what your gut tells you matters. You know, I think a lot of us, you know, back in the early days, I knew what I wanted to do, and I completely rejected it out of fear. And that doesn't mean that the journey I've had hasn't been amazing, but I do worry about the people who don't fight as hard as I did, and I want to make it easier so they don't have to fight so hard.
Thank you, Kelley.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing, inspirational as always. I want to thank Kelley for her time here today, and thank you all for listening. If you want to learn more about the gender wealth gap and what people like Kelley are doing to combat it, you can visit. It's the Women's Fund, centralohio.org.
All right.
Correct?
That's it.
And thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.